Hi, I'm Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm here with a belated May wrap-up, and now that we're in June, we're also battling fading light because it's now coming up to the shortest day of the year here in Adelaide. So bear with me if it just starts to become dark and gloomy, although maybe that could be quite flattering. I don't know, the sort of dusk lighting. But I will quickly run through the books I read in May. The first one was Gingerbread by Helen Oyeyemi, and Annie and I talked about this on the podcast. So Annie loves Helen Oyeyemi, and she was an author I've been meaning to read, so we were really happy to do this one. I had mixed feelings. I really loved the writing. The tone of her writing is very warm and engaging and at times funny. I liked the humour and the strong women characters. So it's mainly the mother and daughter, Harriet, and her daughter, Perdita. And I enjoyed that dynamic. And what I found tricky was all the magic. So there's a lot of fairy tale and metaphysical or supernatural elements, which I found quite slippery, and it just meant that I could never quite get a grasp on the story, and so I couldn't just relax and enjoy it and sort of feel like I was immersed in the story, because I kept being tripped up by what was happening. So one minute, Harriet would be at the parents and friends meeting and giving gingerbread to all the other parents, and that's done in a satirical way, because you can imagine the sort of people at these parents and friends meetings, and it's quite funny, and you feel like you know where you are, and then the next minute her daughter Perdita's eaten a bit of gingerbread, and then she's either disappeared or she's slipped into a coma. And you sort of have to stop and think, hang on, what's just happened? And then it goes on from there. But this was happening, a bit too often for me to fully enjoy it in an unqualified way. But I'm really glad I read it. So that's Gingerbread. And moving on, the next one, and this was also a good one for a celebration or the Asian readathon, and that is At Dusk by Hwang Sok-yong, translated by Sora Kim Russell. And this was a really quiet book, but quite beautiful, and it has stayed with me. It's about Park Min-woo, who's a successful architect in Korea, in Seoul, and he's reflecting back on his life. But it's also the story of Korea and the rapid urban development there, and there's a sense of remorse about that. And I've heard the author speak about it. He was at Adelaide Writers Week, and I actually missed the session, but you can get the podcast if you Google Adelaide Writers Week podcast. You can listen back to it, which is really good. And he spoke about this sense of remorse about what Korea has lost, and all these high-rise apartment buildings that went up very quickly, but that whole neighbourhoods and communities were bulldozed, and people were forced to move, and there was something that was lost in that process. So it's very lightly touching on that, and also it's a sort of a gentle love story between him, or not between, but about him and Cha Suna, who was a girl that he grew up with in the slum neighbourhood that he lived in. So it's a gentle book, but very cleanly written, and it gives you a real sense of what it would have been like to live in Seoul at those times. So I really enjoyed it. I recommend that one. That's At Dusk. And then we come to an interesting one, Ordinary People by Diana Evans. So I bought this just for the cover, I admit, this beautiful cover. And then it was longlisted and then shortlisted for the Women's Prize, which prompted me to pick it up. And I'm glad that I did read it, but it was a strange experience because I loved some of the writing. It's about two couples living in South London, and they have challenges in their marriages, basically, and they have children, and it just explores the tensions that arise and the issues around having children and adjusting to that in the context of a marriage, and trying to forge a life in London in terms of housing and jobs, and just London can be quite expensive and quite tough to live in at times. It describes London beautifully, possibly a bit too much for me, in that every time a character catches a bus or goes to work or somewhere, you get a detailed description of everything they pass along the way. And so that's why some people have said it's a bit listy, which I found it was. I think a little bit of that can go a long way. So I quite enjoyed it, but I thought you do get bogged down a bit in that. It was a bit too much. But some of the writing's really funny as well. So her observations of what it's like to have a small child when you've been perhaps a career person, and then you find yourself going to Baby Beats, which is like a toddler music, session, and just how mind-numbing that can be, and how frustrating, but also that you're meant to be enjoying it, and you're meant to be sort of delighting in spending this time with your child. And there's so many mixed emotions that go into that, and she really draws that out, and I was laughing out loud at that scene. But equally, I was getting frustrated with the characters, because they sort of, then Melissa, that particular character, then gets so bored and frustrated, and she gets resentful and takes it out on her husband, because he sort of swans in at the end of the day and is really chipper from having a day at work, and looks vaguely around for where's dinner and things like that she then gets really bitter about. And I could on the one hand relate to it, on the other hand, that phase is such a short time in the scheme of things that I felt like just saying to the characters, just get over it, it'll be fine. There are bigger problems. But it was ultimately, I thought, quite depressing, in the sense that they do just get very worn down by these sort of everyday issues that I thought they should be able to get over. So I don't know, I might be quite a impatient reader, but anyway, it was interesting. It was a really mixed thing. I loved the writing, and it felt very true and very honest, so I liked that as well. So that's Ordinary People. I think this is a good sort of discussion book, so I'll be interested if you've read it. Let me know what you thought. Then I also read, which I loved, the Good Immigrant USA. And I read The Good Immigrant, which was edited by Nikesh Shukla, which was set essays by immigrants in the UK, and this is the USA version. So edited by Nikesh Shukla and Chimene Suleyman, and it's really, really good. I mean, the essays are by a range of writers, and the quality of them all is excellent. They're very different in terms of their own experience and also the style. So some of them are quite personal, some of them are more historical, some are quite funny, but they all have this shared sort of experience of being treated a bit as the outsider, even though these are really bright and creative people, and just how they've grappled with that sense of being the other, but also balancing that with their home life and their parents' home culture, and the conflicts that can bring up. And it's quite poignant sometimes, that sort of striving for a sense of belonging, and where is home, and sort of questions like that, but explored in a really bracing, honest way. And the essays are all very, very engaging. I can't really pick a favourite, and it's hard, as always with books like this, it's hard to talk about because there are so many different essays you could talk about, so I won't go into them individually, but I highly recommend it. It's a really stimulating read. So that's The Good Immigrant USA. I read another one for the Asian readathon, which I wasn't really doing, but just sort of loosely doing, The Lake by Banana Yoshimoto. And this was on my TBR for a long time, so I was very happy to get to it. It's again sort of a gentle love story, a bit like At Dusk, but quite different as well. You see that because you meet the two characters when they're young. So I think it's Chihiro, one of the young woman, and then Nakajima, and they sort of embark on this very sort of delicate, fragile relationship. And I love the way Banana Yoshimoto shows you how fragile people can be, both as individuals, but also how fragile that relationship can be when a couple comes together. But it can be very tenuous, and she really beautifully describes that. The writing throughout is very clean and honest and at times poetic and really beautiful, and translated, I should have said, by Michael Emmerich. But they get together, but something is really troubling him, and they go down and visit his friends by the lake, and so it just slowly reveals his background and why he's quite reserved about relationships, and sort of what, the darkness that he has faced. And you meet these two friends, and they're quite interesting. So I found it a tiny bit slow, actually, but I love her restraint, the restraint in her writing. It's not too showy. It's very matter of fact, and I love the characters. They're very, you really warm to them. So I'm very happy to have read that. That's The Lake by Banana Yoshimoto. And then finally, I haven't gathered my thoughts for this one, so let's see if I can talk about it sensibly. It's Lanny by Max Porter. I don't really know what to say yet. We're doing it on the podcast, so I have to sit down and think about this before Friday. But essentially it's about a family who have a boy called Lanny, and what happens with Lanny, and how the family manages, and in a small village setting in England. And there's also a character or a thing called Dead Papa Toothwort. And so some chapters are narrated from his point of view or its point of view, and it's not clear what or who Dead Papa Toothwort is. So as you might imagine, that was a struggle for me, and it was immediately, like the first page is Dead Papa Toothwort, and it says it wakes from his standing nap an acre wide and scrapes off dream dregs of bitumen glistening thick with liquid globs of litter. He lies down to hear hymns of the earth. There are none, so he hums. Then he shrinks, cuts himself a mouth with a rusted ring pull, and sucks up a wet skin of acid-rich mulch and fruity detritivores. So that's the opening sort of couple of sentences of Lanny, which really threw me, I have to say. And I thought, again, a bit like Flames, I couldn't have coped, I think, if the whole book was in that vein, as beautiful as that writing is, because I just don't know where I am, what's happening, who is this. And whilst I like a bit of mystery, it was too, it was too bewildering. But then it really brought me back into it, because when he writes from the family's point of view, it's so real, it's so gritty and honest, and very, just incredibly human and relatable and everyday, that it's completely grounds you in the story. So you have a mother who's very devoted to her little boy Lanny. Lanny's unusual, he's very dreamy, he's intelligent, he talks to himself, he lives in his own world. And the father goes off, he commutes to London to work at a bank. So he's off in the financial services world, and a bit more intolerant. But, so he's an unsympathetic character, but that sort of ebbs and flows as the story goes on. And then you meet Mad Pete, who's an artist who starts to teach Lanny a bit about art. So they're sort of like an odd couple. He's a formerly famous artist, but quite idiosyncratic and eccentric is the word I want. And Lanny being, you know, an outsider as well. They have a lovely sort of friendship which develops, and then it takes a turn, or the story then takes a turn halfway through, and you get the points of view of all the, you know, different people from the village. And I thought Max Porter handled that beautifully, because you just get these little snippets and every one of them really rings true. And then it comes sort of to the end, it goes a bit supernatural at the end. I'm back. It stopped recording halfway through that, so I'm not sure where I got to with Lanny, but I was just going to say I had to work a bit with this book, but I was happy to do that because I knew that I was in safe hands with writing that is really accomplished and masterful, and with an author who, you know, has a vision and knows where he's going. So I was happy to do that. I'm still digesting it, so hopefully by Friday when Annie and I sit down, I'll be a bit more coherent and we can have a good chat about Lanny. So that's it for this month, and I'd love to know what you've been reading and if you did any of the Asian readathon, and what you're doing for June. So let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.